So here we are with Melissa Hogenboom, and we are going to talk about sort of the ever-changing identity that happens with motherhood, how motherhood changes your sense of self, your body, your brain, and that some of these changes are lifelong and also in some ways unexpected. So I'm excited to go through the course of motherhood with you. And when reading your book, I'm sure people say this all the time, it brought back so many memories. It's been a while since I've been a mom of babies. And when you were writing your book, you were writing it with an 8-month-old and a toddler. So the descriptions that you give brought back a lot of memories. But the book is called The Motherhood Complex. And I think that's always a good place to start, is defining things. Why did you call it that? And what do you mean by the motherhood complex?
So for me, the reason why I called it a complex is because so many of us many women want to become mothers, but they also expect to. So from a very young age, we're kind of conditioned to believe that motherhood is what, you become as a woman. But then when I became a mother, and then as I was diving into the research, I found that who we are as mothers is very much tied into how other people expect us to be and societal expectations. And that creates like a conflict between your sense of self and the expectations. And so I was like, wow, that is quite just a complex thing. And it feels, that clash of identity that you feel and your whole life changes. I just found that was so tied into how you see yourself, how other people see you. And I was like, I'm just going to call it a motherhood complex. I didn't want it to be overly negative. But I think I wanted to touch upon the fact that there's so many things going on at once, and giving a name to it really validated, I think, what I experienced and what I know lots of other people experienced.
And there's many different types of mothers, right? So there's birthing mothers, there's adoptive mothers, there's transgender mothers, there's mothers that are in same-sex couples. So there's lots of different identities within motherhood. And one arena that you explore a lot is the identity of the birthing mother. So the mother that is pregnant and the impact of pregnancy on your brain as well as your body and your identity. So I'd love to start there with just pregnancy, and because that's often when we start to feel, for some birthing mothers, when they start to feel like they are becoming a mother. What are some of the brain and identity changes that happen in those early days of motherhood?
Yeah, I loved discovering more about this because I think I came at it with finding it annoying how many people were talking about mum brain or pregnancy brain. And I was like, what are they talking about? Like, I was quite adamant for there not to be many differences when I became pregnant. I think in hindsight, that wasn't maybe necessarily healthy because obviously your body's undergoing huge changes. I was looking into the brain changes just because I'd heard that word bandied about quite like loosely and kind of in a negative way. And it turns out there is plenty of neuroscience that shows that the brain does change during pregnancy in a lasting way. So they've done follow-up studies. I can literally tell just from brain scans alone, people who have been pregnant versus not. And it's beneficial. So like gray matter is essentially pruned in a way that neuroscientists say allows the synapses to better potentially connect, like how you might prune a garden. They say, getting rid of all the bad weeds. And it's the same kind of similar brain changes to what we see like teenagers go through these huge transitions. It's a time that your brain is literally adapting to a potential change in your day-to-day life. And the parts of the brain that they noticed changes were parts relating to empathy and theory of mind, so like putting yourself into other people's shoes. So really is important for caregiving. So I thought that was really fascinating. So it's a real thing, mum brain, I would say, but it's not detrimental, I would also say.
And some of those other things that we associate with mom brain, like memory and recall, which there is a difference there in terms of postpartum, but they may be influenced by other factors, not necessarily due to brain changes, but maybe things like sleep or stress.
Yeah, exactly. There are studies that show that there is a slight cognitive decline, but it's not as big as like it's barely noticeable. It's really around like small everyday things. And what was interesting about it is the self-reported cognitive decline was greater than the actual one. So it shows that you expect to have this mum brain, and so your self-reported idea of how you're performing in tasks is actually lower than you actually are performing. Again, like if you think about what's happening during pregnancy and afterwards, when you become a mother, you're sleep deprived, you're focused on a new being for the first time in your life, potentially, if it's the first time. You have to care for their every need. So, of course, you're going to be tired, and sleep deprivation, tiredness, focus on something new is exhausting. And when you're tired and exhausted, you do experience cognitive decline in other things. So, it's really hard to uncouple what part is sleep deprivation. So, mum brain is it's a real thing, but it's not a result of being a mom or being pregnant per se. It's just the side effects of it, if that makes sense.
And it's also just sort of all the stigma that gets associated from the moment that you're pregnant, and especially for folks that have careers or in the workplace. No matter how supportive of a workplace you're in, I think that at least for me, when I learned I was pregnant with my first child, I was working in a treatment center run by a woman psychologist, all woman team. And this was a psychologist who would like pump her breast milk during supervision with me. I mean, she was very supportive of motherhood and very, open about working motherhood. And I still remember being terrified of telling her that I was pregnant. Mm. And because I was worried, I was the clinical director of a treatment center. I was in a, sort of a position where there's a lot of responsibilities, a lot of crises that were on my plate. And those types of biases we carry with us in a supportive environment. I can't even imagine what it would be like in a not a supportive environment. One of the stories that you share is about how when you told folks that you were pregnant, and it was a really peak performance job situation, and how that influenced you. So I wonder if you could share that story, and also how telling that we're pregnant to others is shaped by gender biases in the workplace.
Yeah, of course. So I also agonized about when to share, and I wasn't really showing, but I was like 17 or 18 weeks, and I was, having medical appointments every few weeks, and I was like, oh, they probably know, I should probably say something. I worked with a team quite remotely, so I didn't see them face to face on a daily basis like I was in London. Some of my team were in Bristol, a couple of hours away, but we had this amazing shoot planned with Sir David Attenborough in his home, which was just, I was like so nervous. It was like at the time quite a career defining interview that I was getting to lead, and it was live on social media, so we did one of those Facebook Live performances. And I had just shared it with my team prior to the interview, and everyone was like really excited. Everyone was really positive, as I thought they would be, because two of my colleagues were parents themselves. And then I was chatting away to David, and there was some technical glitches, so we were just talking about life and university. And then my teammate I'm not sure if it was an interruption or part of the conversation. He's like, "Oh, and do you know what? She's pregnant, so she'll be off soon." Like he said it in a positive way, like, "Oh, she's one of my great producers, and she's off to have a baby." And then I was kind of like, I can't believe that he shared that news for me, even though he was saying it in a positive way. Like he was supportive, he was positive, he was just like kind of having a chit chat. But I just remember that was kind of the first experience where I was like, oh, I don't want this news to overshadow what I'm doing then or afterwards. Like I didn't want people to presume I was going to be off, and I was always like, oh, well, I'm not taking much time off. And I always felt like I had to then justify the fact that I was taking off and mention I was coming back to show my commitment. And I mean, it turns out there's reasons why we do this, because during pregnancy and afterwards, women are literally seen as like less ambitious, less committed, and often that actually plays out in reality. So you're less likely to get promotion, less likely to a pay rise. And so what you'll find is then, even if women were ambitious and their ambition didn't change, they might tone it down, because otherwise their lived reality doesn't align with their like experience in the real world. So if you're ambitious but you're constantly getting pushed back, what's the way to make that feel more comfortable? To stop being ambitious. So and you hear women say it all the time. It's like, oh, well, I loved my job, but when I had kids, I couldn't do both, or I couldn't continue the high-paced career. And it's kind of mad that we live in a world where we have to pick, and one comes at a detriment for the other, because both is unhealthy, right? Like we want to be there for our children, we want to pursue careers, but it shouldn't have to have this constant clash. And yet, I think the kind of work culture we've built up in the West has made it inevitable.
Yeah, it seems like there's some cultures that do it better than others. And when you start to look at the research, the US always kind of fares the worst
So
in
I know,
everything. I
per
mean,
you.
yeah, poor us over here. And it also shows up in our happiness reports that we don't do so well in terms of our happiness, in part because of the lack of support, yes, during pregnancy, the lack of support postpartum, and lack of support for both parents, for fathers as well. And what the research shows in terms of parental leave for fathers, how that is so positive for the family and outcome, mental health wise, of the mother.
Yeah, it's amazing that there's policies that allow fathers to take paid time off. It has to be paid because sadly we live in a world where men tend to earn more than women, and so if it's not paid, then it's going to cause a financial burden. There's lasting benefits of a father taking time off in terms of his own physical, like brain changes, his bonding with his child. There's even evidence to show that when the male partner in a heterosexual couple takes time off, a woman's earnings are more likely to increase. It kind of all boils down to inequality. If there's inequality in the home sphere, then it's going to be impossible to break out of that and achieve in the work environment, which means you kind of have this double bind of having a motherhood penalty, which is a literal term sociologists have coined to show the drop in earnings that happens when you become a mother, and then like lifelong earning potential. And so it's not just like, obviously money is not everything, but for a father to also be there for his child is going to have lasting beneficial impacts on the finances, the well-being of the couple, the happiness, the relationship between the two partners. I mean, you touched upon happiness there. Yeah, if there's constant stress and a juggle and inequality, then it literally carries resentment, and that builds. And the more resentment there is, and the more discrepancy there is between how much you do at home and how much you think you do versus how much you think your partner do, can literally like lead to divorce. That's up by studies. I'm not just being dramatic here.
Well, and the sensitization of the brain in terms of caregivers. So whether or not you've given birth to the child that you care for or not, your brain is changed by the activity of caregiving. And that's
Yeah.
what's so wonderful about just the human species, is that you don't have to have biologically given birth to a baby to develop some of these brain areas that are associated with caring and attachment and the good stuff that comes with
Oh
parenting.
yeah. Oh yeah. Like, so that's one of the, I think that's probably one of the lasting snippets of kind of scientific insight that really stuck with me. It's something called experience dependent plasticity. So that's a bit clunky, but it literally means that anything we do in life can change our brain, because our brain is plastic, as we know. A pianist will have a slightly different brain to a non-pianist. And it really debunks the idea that women are biologically destined to be the primary caregivers. Sure, we get ahead if you are the biological mother. Sure, you get a head start in terms of the hormones. Your body's, literally producing milk if you're able to breastfeed. But evidence shows that if fathers spend equal amounts of time with a child, or if there's a male primary caregiver, his brain will change to almost comparable levels to the woman's, and release oxytocin as well. So it just shows, like, simply by being there, but your brain will change and react to a caregiving role. And then you can see that on a practical level as well. I write a lot in the book about the mental load. If you must know about the mental load, right? If you're doing everything and thinking about everything, you become better at it, both on a practical level and biological. So if you're not sharing the load, your brain's not going to change, and then again, that would have lasting effects. So I love that, because I think to reach equality, we have to get away from the idea that a woman's role is to be a mother and that's her destiny. I mean, we didn't see that in prehistory. In some hunter-gatherer tribes, we don't see that. So why are we kind of living out these gender roles?
So you talk about cognitive load, and that is something that I think people often don't think about in terms of caregiving and motherhood, where it's not just the physical load of like actually having the baby or nursing the baby if you nurse or carting the toddler off to preschool, but there's a whole part of parenting, which is the mental part, which is the worry, the planning, the organizing. And my last night I was reading through your book, and I was on. It was after dinner. The kids were back in the back of the house brushing their teeth, and my partner was working on camp organization. So for those of you that are working parents, there's a section of the year, like 12 weeks, where you have no school, you have nothing. You have to like piecemeal childcare together for your kids. And it involves this crazy making matrix of camp formation, which is painful in so many different levels because you have one kid going to one area, another kid going to another area. Some things are 8 to 12, some things are 9 to 2, whatever. And so he has taken that on full on as his project to do the full, and I don't even have to think about it. It's not even something on my radar. He's doing 100% of it. And I was able to sit down and read your book and prepare for this interview. And it's things like that that I think that mothers in traditional genderized households of heterosexual couples, or even in same-sex couples where one person just takes on more of that load. And it's a lot. It's draining.
It's so much, and it's draining because it's invisible, and it's hard to put down, and um, it's hard to quantify even. You carry it with you because you feel like it's your responsibility. So if you were thinking about camps and there was a deadline, you can't like switch off that part of your brain. I mean, I've made a summer camp spreadsheet, believe it or not, just because last year I was like suddenly my daughter's only just started school, so we're quite new to having to fill the summer. And I was like, what do I do? And even next week, we've got it's Easter break. And so like my husband was like busy planning his week next week. And I was like, you do realize she's finishing at 3 every day, right? And he's like, oh, it's like, what's next week? Because he's like, oh, I can't wait to get back to, kids in childcare next week. And I'm like, well, next week's also going to be, because we've both been off with COVID this past 2 weeks. And I mean, he won't mind me saying this, but I had to remind him because it's in my brain, the child holidays, the camps, because I have taken that on and I'm aware of it, which I think is the first step to anyone else nodding along. Because it's not just the big things, it's things like the shopping list, the shoe sizes, the nappies, the formula, knowing when the clothes are going to run out, knowing if you need a swimming costume in advance of a holiday break because the last one will have been too small. So it's all these tiny little things and they add up, and they are ever present and you can take them to work with you. And the reason why women tend to do a lot of it is often because, we're the ones who stay at home on maternity leave for longer. And so we kind of get habituated to these tasks and then there's no handover. So that's what sociologists have found. Even in couples that set out to do things 50-50, very rarely do they sit down and like write a list, go, right, you're going to do this and I'm going to do this. You kind of fall into these gendered patterns. And unless you talk about it, it's hard to notice. And I think even though I'm like quite aware of what's going on in terms of our own relationship, I hadn't really clocked about the mental load until I read about it. And I was like, yeah, why am I always the one packing for holidays? And why do I know exactly where all the clothes are? Like I know where to find, even if, my daughter's messed up her clothes cupboard, I'm like, I know where her vests are and I know where this is. Why am I the one that knows that? And so, yeah, there's, I think being aware of it to anyone who wants solutions is really important, and then making sure it's end to end, like what your husband does. It has to be the thinking ahead, the organizing, the anticipation, and the decision making. It's no good just the doing part is no good if you haven't done the planning or the thinking ahead, or having to be reminded, because then even if you're doing all the things required, if someone is like project managing that, then that's still
It's exhausting.
adds to
Yeah.
the load. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
exhausting, and that's why I think we're women and mothers are just tend to be more exhausted from it all.
So there's two things that I want to add to that and sort of build on in terms of this conversation that actually came up for me around like the whole camp thing. One is when people start planning camps, you start planning when your kids are a little older, you plan like whose friends are you going to be in camps with, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
what happens is the mothers create the group text
Mm.
with me on it. And then I have to rope my partner in to be on the group text because there's an assumption. First, there's an assumption that that's going to be my job, is the camp job,
Yeah.
right? So that's the one thing we also have to change our programming around, is not assume, not assume that the sports parent that's going to bring the drinks is going to be the mom. Right? Not assume that the high school party planner is going to be the mom. That these are just assumptions that we just are swimming in that we don't even think about, right? But the other thing that came up for me around it, which I think is a common thread that starts in pregnancy and is carried all the way to being like a 65-year-old, 70-year-old mother, which I have in my practice. So motherhood doesn't end when your children leave the house, is guilt. And the guilt of not being the person that's planning the camps, and the guilt of not being the person that's bringing the brownies, or the guilt of not being the person that's breastfeeding until 2 years, or whatever that mother guilt is around the idealized mother. So I want to talk a little bit about that, mothers and guilt, and how that shapes our identity as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, mum guilt's another one, like the mum brain thing that I you can just hear banded about. It's like we are all aware we have it. It's like, oh, just feeling a bit of mum guilt whenever we do something that's slightly not seen as perfect. But fathers don't do that. And sociologists have studied motherhood guilt extensively, actually, and they do find, as you say, it's tied to these kind of perfect parenting ideals. And we're so kind of conscious of what a perfect mother should be that anything that below that we feel guilty for. And then we also feel guilty for sending our kids to childcare, or for, feeding them something that's not as nutritious as, a home cooked meal full of five vegetables. But all the things that are on that kind of the perfect mother list are impossibly high standards. And what I've always find so frustrating is if we kind of martyr ourselves for our children to the extent that we become less happy, what message are we then sending to our kids? So I think it's really important to recognize the guilt you feel and then learn about why. Like, I know for a fact that my kids are better off in childcare than with me all day because I can't keep up the energy levels all day long that they can when they're, with professionals who are brilliant and give them age appropriate activities and are there for them with full energy all day long, whereas I'm trying to run a household and do admin, and I can't sit and play with them all day long, nor do I want to, nor should I. It's literally not how we evolved. And I think it kind of all ties to the mental load a bit. Like, the reason why we take on so much of it is because we're expected to, like the camps. We're expected to do it, and then if we don't, we feel guilty. We're judged for it, right? Like, women are like, if you've got a screaming toddler in a supermarket, you might be judged as being a bad mother, because it's not what they'd expect a mother to behave. Or if you're not responding in a warm way because they are acting up and you should not be pandering to it, they might think that you're being a bad mother. And we feel this and we internalize it, and that kind of manifests in, like, essentially maternal gatekeeping. So that's the phrase used for taking ownership of some of the activities that we do when it comes to, like, planning and organizing, because we as women are judged for things in a way that men aren't, and so we do more of it, and it just has to stop. And it's not just stressful on a day-to-day level. It can literally lead to parental burnout, which is it's a newly kind of diagnosed phenomenon, and it's becoming more present. And like, if you think about how families used to, like, operate in terms of you'd have more support around you. In ancient evolutionary past, we grew up in groups of hunter-gatherers. It was never set up to be this kind of nuclear family where there's only two primary caregivers, and then if most of the pressure is on one, it's no wonder why we feel stressed and we're failing. And coupled that with the fact that more women work today than they ever did before, but the expectations of what a mother does haven't really moved in along with that.
So what's interesting about guilt and motherhood guilt is that, and it kind of links to burnout, is that mother's guilt is actually also associated with reduced health practices. So there's some research to suggest that mothers exercise less than non-mothers. Mothers consume more sugary drinks than non-mothers, and mothers' sleep efficacy is reduced, obviously, than non-mothers. And guilt is a predictor of that. But what's really interesting is that mothers who have higher levels of self-compassion, it actually mediates that relationship between guilt and taking care of your health. So that being like, I'm going to a yoga class, I feel guilty. And then I have self-compassion. I need to care for myself so that when I come back and I'm back from yoga, I can be less irritable with my kids. I can be more present with my partner. My nervous system will be a little bit more settled, and I'll be a happier mom to be around. I'll be a more pleasurable mom to be around. And I can have some compassion for myself that I need this class. Otherwise, I'm gonna, as I tell my kids, I'm about to lose my marbles. I'm leaving.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's part that we also have to wrap our heads around, is that it's a system. And for mothers to work with the guilt, I think guilt is inevitable because we feel guilty because we care a lot. But it becomes misdirected. It becomes a problem when it starts to shape our behavior in ways that actually harm our children and our families and ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think if there's anything, it again comes down to recognizing when we feel it and why, and then knowing when to shrug it off. So I'm the same. I feel like I should be spending quality time on the hour that I have of the day before school or childcare drop off. But in reality, it's not special time. Everyone's stressed and getting dressed and running around eating breakfast and spilling it. And so I'm like, right, I'm going for a run. I know I'm going to be home early because my hours tend to finish. I tend to finish work earlier than my husband. And so I always have like that extra hour in the evening. And so I'm like, well, I can fit in my run in that half an hour of time when they're kind of causing havoc. And then when I come back, they're going to childcare. And so I have that time to myself to take a shower. Whereas if I did the run later, then it would reduce the pre-work time. And so I could like feel guilty about it, but I know that I will be more refreshed, a better mother if I take that time for myself. And I think you kind of have to, however little time you can carve out for yourself, work backwards or forwards or whatever's most helpful. Because some stay-at-home moms literally do not get a time of 5 minutes in the day if their partners leave work at 7 a.m. and aren't back till late. That's the reality of people with long commutes. So it's just finding the snippets of time where you can be yourself and do something for yourself, because it's not natural to sacrifice every part of your day for your children, even though we are sold this idea that motherhood means self-sacrifice. I don't think that is correct, and I think it's very unhealthy, because then we will become less happy, and our kids will see that. And then when you look at the research that shows like daughters of like mothers who work are more likely to end up in like higher income jobs themselves. Like we're literally setting an example for our own children of what's possible in terms of just day to day, but also gender roles. So I think it's really important and good for your family's well-being to put yourself first where you can, and just know the balance. And then if that triggers guilt, just brush it off if you can do that.
A way that I've conceptualized it over time is putting our family's well-being first. And that means it means all of us. And seeing that, for example, some boundaries that I set around bedtimes with my kids, that is for their well-being, and it's also for my well-being. It's both.
Yeah.
And that it impacts their mood the next morning. It impacts their ability to pay attention in school, but it also impacts my mood because I get a little bit of time with them in bed. So I think that it's just, I think a lot of the way that we view things is so individual in nature. And we think that it's like it's work or parenting, it's mom time or it's kid time. And we're much more emic than we think we are. For me, and actually this is some of the work that my good friend Yael Schumbrun, she's a psychologist at Brown, and she writes and teaches on, is that my work life enhances my home life, and my home life enhances my work life, and my friend life enhances my partnership life, and my partnership life enhances my parenting life, and that they all kind of feed into each other, as opposed to like, we have to just focus on one. or the other, or prioritize this.
That's really poetic, actually. I think that we do get a lot from all our different relationships, and no one individual can fulfill all those roles. And I'm with you on bedtime, like 7 p.m., lights out. But I agree with what you say on like we have these strict divisions between kind of work life, parenting, and our own time, which is I think it's a consequence of the society we live in because you don't see that in kind of many indigenous groups where kind of family life is much more together. Everybody contributes. Childhood isn't infantilized in the way that we do so in the West. And I'm always careful when I talk about cross-cultural comparisons because you can't transport like desirable things from one culture and bring it to the other. But we have such a strong division of childcare, of childhood and adulthood that we operate in such different sphere. Like being called childish is an insult, right? And it shouldn't be. Like a child should have age appropriate goals and age appropriate activities, but it doesn't mean that they can't contribute to family life. Try my best to kind of like practice what I preach with regards to that. Like if I'm the other day I was trying to clean their handprints off the window. We've got these big glass doors which you can see behind me, and they're just constantly full of handprints. And of course the kids wanted to help, and I knew that like they would create more watermarks on the windows and they'd splash water everywhere. And I was like really fighting with myself, saying, let mommy do it, let mommy do it. And I was like, right, okay. And I gave them each a cloth and they both helped. And of course, they made loads of mess and it just created twice the work. But I know that giving them meaningful tasks actually pay off later on because if they see that they're contributing to household tasks in a meaningful way, they will learn. I think they will learn to continue to do that. Like there's, I don't know if you have come across this, but there's research where literally like Western women, like women from Western countries, are more likely to give their children mock work, so like pretend work. Like here's a pretend broom where you can sweep the
Oh,
floor, and
yeah.
here's a pretend, yeah, yeah.
No.
And I mean, I've got a toy kitchen, and it's kind of it's a distraction, and it's because the kids want to do what the adults do. And the
Yeah.
reason I'm bringing this up is because they understand that they're not doing meaningful help, and that's a demotivator. And so when you talk about like family life and happiness and well-being, it kind of literally does come down to all being part of it together and them learning early on to contribute and to know what needs to be done. And I think bringing that in early on is it's difficult, but it's important.
Yes. So we can take that and fast forward it to teenagers and young adults. And then eventually, like I mentioned, I have parents in my practice that are in their 60s and 70s, older adults. The time that you put in to creating intrinsic motivation in young children and having that be sort of the philosophy of your household. In our household, it's sort of we all are householders. And so we
Mm.
all contribute to the household. I have my kids write up what their contributions are, or we figure it out collaboratively. But that sets them up for things like in college, seeing that they are part of the household, they're part of the group, they make an important contribution. But I think that one of the things that happens for us, again, as parents and as mothers, is that not only does our whole identity change and shift with pregnancy, that you had this line in your book where you kind of were saying how inside your head you were like, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant, like everywhere you went. And I felt that when I was pregnant. It was like this thing that happened to me, and now that it would never go away. It's there now. Like I'm a mother, and I feel that. But that our identity as a mother also changes as at different developmental stages of our children. For example, when my kids were little, I would say that I prioritized my newborns and my little babies more than I did my work. My work was kind of like on like a kind of keeping an even keel so that I could put a lot of energy into just how much energy it took to have young children. And now that my children are in sort of the sweet spot of 9 to 12, my career is doing this big pickup again. And I know that will kind of come and go with the different stages of life as well. So even our identity as a mother changes over time.
Yeah, I hope you can teach me that you come to terms with it more as you get older. I think I've definitely found that writing about it and learning about the changes in motherhood has definitely made me own it and validated my experience. And now I feel like it's much more aligned with my identity, but I still don't feel like a mom, like fully. And I wonder if that will ever change. Like I don't see myself as like a mumsy mum, or like I always still have that. I was like, oh, other people kind of are mothering better, or they're like, they have all the right snacks, and I'm like scrambling together a thing. Like I think it's good to talk about these things because no one really has it put together in that way, or not many people.
No, I was talking to, I consult with people like around the world, psychologists, and I was talking to yesterday a psychologist from Denmark. And of course, this was on my mind because I knew that I was having this interview. And she works with new parents. In particular, she works with postpartum depression. That's sort of her specialty. And she's using this model ACT. So I'm consulting with her around how to use ACT in her practice. I said, you all are so happy. You keep on winning in the happiness. Everyone in the Scandinavian countries wins in the happiness competition, which Americans have made it a competition, of course. and I was like, how, what are you seeing in terms of like, what happiness and kids and parents and all this? And she said, I actually experience, for the parents that I work with, so much stress of these mothers where, unlike with like American mothers where we feel stress around our children achieving, they feel stress around having, what she described as having the perfect attachment with their kids, like healthy attachment and secure attachment. And that we can turn anything into some kind of a expectation, whether it's that you have to be the perfect attachment parent or you have to have be successful at snacks and achievement.
Exactly. And I think what's worrying about this trend is falling into this pitfall of over-parenting or intensive motherhood. And so by obsessing over attachment or snacks or camp, or like obviously there's the practical things that you have to do, but by obsessing too much, we're actually doing our children a disservice because we're limiting their independence. But at the same time, I think there's this research I came across recently, and I wrote a piece for the BBC about children influence their parents perhaps more so than we think and more so than we can mold them. So I think the most striking fact from that is, so identical twins reared apart are more alike than fraternal siblings reared together. And so if you get your head around that, it takes a while, but it just shows that genetics plays a huge role in how our children are, their natural tendencies, and we as parents respond to that. So we can't mold them, but we can respond to them and respond to how they are. We can't change a shy person to be outgoing, but we can work with them to overcome what's the most challenging. So I think we think we can mold our children, but they will be who they will be, and we will hopefully grow with it and help them achieve their best by responding to them. And I think knowing that takes the pressure off. Like, you can't mold your child into what you want, and if you do, you're going to see a kickback, and then you're going to wonder what you did wrong. What you did wrong might be you didn't listen to what your child wanted, or you tried to think you could control things that you couldn't. And I think that that's what as I get more experienced as a mother, I think that's what my biggest learning or challenge will be, to kind of let my motherhood identity combine with what my children want and not try and force things onto them.
Yes, there's that classic book, the Alison Gopnik, a gardener and a carpenter. It's how do we create that nourishing soil so that it's just sort of like a good garden versus trying to be those carpenter parents that are trying to shape them.
It's hard because we think they need certain things and we're told that, and then we again coupled with the economic uncertainty and the stress and the pandemic and war in the background, it's a really, really tough time for children to be growing up. And so we want to protect them, we want to give them the best chance, but if we are trying to cultivate their lives too much, then we're actually doing the opposite.
Yeah, so I was just talking to a mom of I think her baby's 5 months old, and she said, well, I felt so protected for the first 5 months, especially during COVID. We were all holed up, just our little family doing our thing. And now that some of the COVID restrictions are lifting and we're faced with questions like, do we do swim lessons? And I was like, oh, yes, you are just at the beginning of those questions. And beware of the carpentry, beware of the other carpenters that are out there that say you need to do this now. And it becomes a a competition of, especially for privilege, this is very much for privileged families, like a competition of how much you are doing or what activities your kids are in and whether or not that makes them successful or not successful, but really your own ego as a parent that's wrapped up into all of that. And it's just such dangerous territory, I think, for all of us.
It is, but it's kind of a nat. We also have to recognize it's a natural human tendency to constantly compare ourselves with those around us. I fall into the trap too. I think it's hard when we're surrounded by other people who are also trying to do the best, and then we it makes us judge whether or not we're doing enough for our children as well.
I am aware of our time together and that we need to wrap up, but I also just want to ask you a last question of where are you headed? What projects are you working on?
Yeah, so I'm busy writing a monthly column for BBC Future on Family Tree, it's called. So it's really, I just did a piece on literacy and when's the best time to learn to read. My next piece is going to be a bit about how play has changed throughout the pandemic. And then I'm working on another parenting but childhood book. I'd say I'm still refining the idea, but it's going to send a strong message about how we're all doing too much and we need to slow down for our own happiness and that of our children. Again, evidence-based guide of how we can do that. So I'm going to give, rather than this one was not prescriptive, but I think the next one is going to be kind of the steps we can take to stop doing too much, essentially. So stop getting too involved in our children's lives. Which sounds like a contradiction, but it's not, I promise you.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that many people are struggling with right now of how to stay engaged without burning out. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to speak with
Thank
you.
you.